Chapter 7. Once you've mastered how to analyze relative clauses, participial and prepositional phrases that function as adjectives should be a snap. At least I'm hoping they will be easier. If you have worked with these kinds of phrases before, you probably never thought of them as phrases that have been reduced down from relative clauses. But it makes a lot of sense to do so, as it demonstrates how native speakers of English use the language efficiently. You might be tempted to think of this as something like cutting corners, but really it's more about avoiding empty prose. The verb be is a very important one in our language, but writers are usually encouraged not to overuse it because even though it's not in a passive voice, it's kind of passive. It's just about things existing, whereas action verbs give your writing a more dynamic quality. In the last few chapters of our book, you will learn about other grammatical constructions that involve deleting something, and usually this involves deleting something having to do with the verb be. We do it a lot in our language. I think of it a lot when I see road signs along the way when I'm driving that say things like speed limit 25 instead of the speed limit is 25, or road closed or road work ahead instead of the road is closed or there is road work ahead. The essential meaning can be conveyed without the be verb. You don't necessarily need to know this to analyze the sentences, but the deletion of the relative pronoun and be verb to form a participial or a prepositional phrase can only be done when the relative pronoun functions as the subject of the original relative clause. This is explained on page 160. This way of looking at the phrases also relates back to the idea of transformations that we dealt with in chapter 5. Think of the first version of the sentence on page 60 as the original course sentence. That is, the students who were protesting the new dorm rules assembled on the steps of the administration building. As so. And the reduced version with who were deleted as a kind of transformation of it. So we take that out and we have the students protesting the new dorm rules. Our main concern in this chapter is with these three phrases: present participial phrases, past participial phrases, and prepositional phrases. They all function as adjectives, just like the relative clauses that they are derived from. Let's look at them separately. So first, let's go back to the example sentence in the book. The students who were protesting the new dorm rules assembled on the steps of the administration building. On page 59, just before this page, we can see how this sentence with a relative clause was a combination of two different sentences. The students assembled on the steps of the administration building, and the students were protesting the new dorm rules. So to be efficient, we combine these two sentences in the way, we last chapter we did it as relative clauses. Now we're combining them and reducing them down even further. In the second sentence, the main verb, were protesting, would be labeled present progressive. And if you remember this from chapter 3, progressive aspect is shown by a be auxiliary plus the present participle of the verb, the ing verb form. That is why when we delete the who were from the sentence with the relative clause, we call the phrase that remains, which is protesting the new dorm rules, we call it a participial phrase. It is a verb phrase headed by a participle form of the verb. Even though this then is a partial predicate and is not finite, not tensed, it is still going to be one of the 6 verb types and needs to be labeled as such. In the same way that present participial phrases are derived from relative clauses that have main verbs showing progressive aspect, past participial phrases are derived from relative clauses with main verbs that are passive. And passives are formed by using a be auxiliary plus a past participle form of the verb. If you are looking at the long example sentence on page 162 and 3, you can see that the past participial phrase taught by their teachers, or taught by their primary teachers, is derived from the passive sentence students are taught by their primary teachers, with are taught being the passive main verb. Diagramming past participial phrases can be tricky for at least two reasons. The first is that it's not practical to attempt doing the passive transformation as I've been encouraging you to do for regular passive sentences. For these phrases that we learned back in Chapter 5, largely because they are embedded in a larger clause or sentence. And I won't give you those to do for your assigned sentences either. And the second reason is the verb in these phrases is always transitive, but many of these phrases may not appear to have a direct object, and so they don't look transitive, so they're very tricky. An example of the latter would be our current sentence with the word phonics left off. All right, and then adjectival prepositional phrases. So far in this course, most of the prepositional phrases we have looked at have been adverbial. They tell us how or where or when an action is done. For example, Sue walked with a limp to the store. Sue walked in the morning. We have also seen prepositional phrases that were genitive, all of which use the preposition of. But prepositional phrases can also be adjectival. They are considered to be derived from relative clauses whose verb phrase predicate is comprised of a be verb plus an adverb of place, with this adverb of place being a prepositional phrase. There are a couple of example sentences on page 164 that show that when reducing the relative clause to a prepositional phrase, we delete the relative pronoun and the form of the verb be. Distinguishing the adjectival from the adverbial prepositional phrases might be a bit confusing at first, since, ironically, the adjectival ones, as I just mentioned, are derived from relative clauses that have a be verb plus an adverb of time, so an adverb of time. But there are a couple of ways of testing for adjectival prepositional phrases. The first is to put the relative pronoun and form of be back in the sentence with the prepositional phrase. As with this sentence, if you get the sentence, I smelled the hay in the barn, and you're wondering about in the barn, that's a prepositional phrase, but most of the ones I've seen so far have been adverbial. So how do I figure this out? Well, if you put that is back in, I smell the hay, that is in the barn, then you know that it's an adjectival prepositional phrase. And the second thing you can do, and this doesn't work for all sentences, but if the prepositional phrase is adjectival, you can often make a one-word adjective out of it and put it in front of the noun it describes. For example, I hated the show on television, or the show that was on television, if you want to put that back in. But if you then I say, I hated the television show, you see that the prepositional phrase on television is describing the television, the show in the same way that the adjective would be doing. So that makes a lot of sense. When I teach this course in the classroom, I usually try to lighten things up a little bit by bringing in my guitar to demonstrate these adjectival prepositional phrases with the kids' song, The Green Grass Grows All Around. You can hear it by clicking on the link on our Course Connect page. You're probably already familiar with it, though. You can also find the link there to the lyrics of the song, where the string of prepositional phrases functioning as adjectives gets longer and longer. There's also a link to the diagram I created to some of those lyrics, and you could possibly manage to do a diagram for the whole longest sentence. But you know how the song goes, the germ on the bug, and the bug on the feather, and the feather. Okay, you get the idea. You don't need to hear me sing. All right, so, but then after this, there are more sections in the chapter, but for the most part, they are self-explanatory. For now, I would just mention that it is good to know that both the kind of phrases we study in this chapter and relative clauses are what we call restrictive, and as such, they are not set up by commas. In a later chapter, we'll talk about what does restrictive mean, and you don't have to worry about that for now. It is not much of an issue for you here, but in Chapter 9 we will discuss non-restrictive phrases and clauses, and those are set off by commas. Also, this section on grammatical ambiguity on page 173 is interesting and useful. For the example sentence there, as with most others like it, you can determine whether the meaning of the sentence shows an adjective or adverbial prepositional phrase by putting the relative pronoun and the be verb back in the sentence. If it makes sense, then the phrase is adjectival. The sentence there is, Tamara Pierce wrote the book in our living room. And if you don't have the that is, that is in our living room, it's really ambiguous. But if you have the that is, then we know that Tamara Price wrote the book that is in our living room. So she didn't write the book in her living room. Okay, well that's it. So please let me know if you have questions on the material, and good luck with your quiz 7.